and welcome back to Be Poke on Point. I'm really excited to share my first interview with a guest who we're going to call Jasmine. She's going to tell us about a man she met, eventually married, and had a baby with, and was very lucky to escape due to his abusive nature over the span of several years. I've met so many women from many walks of life who were or still are in an abusive relationship. Jasmine shares red flags to look out for and advice for you if you have a friend suffering from something similar. I chose her story because it ends on a happy note, and I believe she will inspire you to get the help you need and see a way out. That being said, let's get right into it. Jasmine, why don't you tell us how you met?
I've heard this happen, many times, that one of the things online dating does is it facilitates your mind in a way that makes you open to actually meeting someone. So I've heard it time and time again from friends. When you put yourself out there on online dating, that is also the same time you end up meeting someone in person. And that is exactly what happened to me. I was at a cultural festival in my hometown
Okay.
at the time,
Okay.
and I someone came up to me and just simply introduced themselves. And I was thinking, it's been so hard to meet someone. I've tried the online dating apps, and now
Right.
here I am with someone actually approaching me in person. So that's how we met.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And where did things go from there? Did you hang out at the festival that day? Did you exchange numbers that day? How did you basically interact with him?
So I at the time said I didn't want to give my number out, and I didn't have very much personal information, or so I thought, on Facebook. So I said, why don't we exchange Facebook accounts?
Wow. Okay. It's interesting you say that because I've done several episodes on online safety and how much information you give. And you just said something I've talked about before where you don't really realize the size of your audience online. So thanks a lot for bringing that up as well. Okay, go on.
So nothing really accelerated very quickly. It was a lot of back and forth, and I was very busy. I was focused on my studies at the time as well, and that did take priority over dating in that moment. But one of the things that he did that made him stand apart from the other people that took an interest in me was his persistence. He was
Yeah.
extremely persistent. And they say hindsight is 2020. So, things that I realize about that persistence now, I didn't realize about that persistence in the beginning.
Okay.
Um, so essentially, he was able to step in when I was in a bad place with another relationship that had ended. And I
Okay.
said, you know what? Why don't I just go for the nice guy? Why don't I just go for the guy that has been continuously asking me out for a lengthy period of time, despite me essentially putting him off at first?
Right.
And that's kind of where my mindset was at the time that we started talking in a more romantic fashion.
Okay, I see. Yeah, and I get what you mean about consistency because it's very attractive. Like consistency is so scarce. I'm actually going to bring that up in a future episode as well, when I talk about dating and finding your person, etc. Okay, so back to you. Then, when was, I guess, your first red flag, or did you have any red flags? I know that you ended up marrying him, and we'll get into the details of that. But was there anything pre-marriage that was a red flag that you ignored?
So I would say that a lot of the issues I had accelerated in phases. So essentially, this individual had, certain monumental life moments that accelerated his temper, and his sort of ill will towards me. So in the
Wow.
beginning, it wasn't consistent. We would go long stretches of time where things were essentially fine. It's a dating phase. There's not the pressure of marriage, there's not the pressure of having to be living under the same roof with another person. So you can really only get to know someone, to a certain extent under those circumstances. They say you don't truly know someone until you've lived with them, right?
Yeah, exactly. They say
So,
that.
the things that looking back, there were red flags, but could I see them? No. And why? Because they were happening in isolation. They weren't consistently happening all the time. When they did happen, there was always a very logical explanation, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
me, the way I was raised, it was always, to have empathy, have compassion towards other people. Try to
Yeah.
put yourself in their shoes and understand how they're feeling. And, I spent most of my life essentially studying in advanced degrees. I hadn't had a lot of exposure to the world of serious dating in terms of talking to someone that I may potentially marry. So
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
have, yeah, I didn't have a lot of experience in this area.
Okay.
So, things that were red flags, yes, there would be a flare up of a temper here and there, but he always had a logical explanation for it. So, for example, one explanation will be, my own family has treated me badly. My circumstances in the past make me react this way.
Mm-hmm.
So always that he had a victim mentality. And me being, sort of an inexperienced person with um, not a lot of aptitude in this area, would
Right.
say, it's okay. Things are going to get better. Let's talk this out and figure out how to move forward. This was always my reaction. You know,
Yeah.
in retrospect, my reaction should have been, these are huge red flags that are only going to get
Yeah.
worse, but these are things you don't know at the time.
Right. And that's when you actually, that's an opportunity for you to set your standards or your boundaries with someone. It's actually when something occurs,
Yes.
because you might excuse it once or twice, but when someone keeps playing the victim mentality, it's actually a turn off. As in, like, why don't you just take responsibility for your behavior? If I remember correctly, he was a few years older than you, right?
Yeah, we had a 10-year age gap.
Oh, 10 years.
Yes.
So I don't know. It's kind of funny, but it's like we expect someone 10 years older than us to be, more emotionally mature and handle situations better than us, let's say. But that never ends up happening lately. That's what I see. Okay,
Well, I mean,
so.
if you
Mhm,
think about it, it's not so much the age; it's the
mhm,
type of psychological makeup that you're dealing with in another person. So, someone that suffers from some sort of psychological deficiency, it doesn't matter
mhm.
how old they are. Their life experience isn't going to inform them in a way to make better decisions, which is what would happen if someone was on a sort of a regular developmental path.
So, but how do you think you can, I guess, determine that, because you're also feeling romantic towards someone. So I think us, like men or women, if you're having romantic feelings towards someone, we tend to excuse their behavior more. Do you know what I mean? So is there anything you can teach me, the audience, how, like, how many chances do you give someone now in retrospect? How many chances do you give someone, or what has to happen for you to actually just say, "Okay, this person is just, mentally not fit for me at this stage."
Well, I don't think there's a mathematical formulation for it. And,
Mhm.
I'm not a
Okay.
psychologist. I can only speak from my own experience here.
Right.
In my
Mhm.
experience, and just sort of also now being sort of on the outside of this
Yes.
situation, being able to look back and think about it, and also seeing, various friends and colleagues going through similar situations in their marriages. Um, I think one pattern I've noticed,
Mhm.
just from personal experience, is that those isolated events accelerate. When you accept them, they accelerate because the person now knows what your reaction to that type of behavior is going to be. So if your
Right.
reaction is empathy, your reaction is forgiveness, or your reaction is uh, excusing the behavior,
Right.
that really only like sort of perpetuates the acceleration of that down the road.
Yeah, because they know they can get away with it. Like, okay, you've forgiven them in the
Exactly.
past, that's fine. You didn't set your boundaries when you had a chance to. So this is something also to start practicing in the future, with like friendships, romantic relationships, with coworkers, etc. Okay, so what do you think triggered him to be angry or act irrational?
I can say that it could be the most irrational thing that
Okay.
triggered him. It wasn't necessarily any action on my part or um, anything concrete that I was doing that would create his frustration, but it was essentially him dealing with whatever was frustrating him in his life and taking it out on the person that was closest to him at the time. So, for example, it could be something as simple as, I planned to go to the beach today and now it's raining and that's your fault. Right? There was not necessarily a rational connection.
Correct.
But because it was happening in sort of isolated incidents, after having long stretches of weeks at a time where things were fine, it was hard to really gauge the cumulative effect of that behavior because it was so infrequent in the beginning. And I would say that that's something that accelerated over time.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I was in the last year of my marriage, I
Mm-hmm.
was able to distinctly, determine at that time what it was that was creating these triggers.
Wow. Okay, wait. Before we get to the marriage part, tell us like what happened before. You dated for how long before he proposed, and then you got married, and then he to my understanding, there was abuse in the relationship. So like, was there any abuse before marriage, and what kind of abuse, if you're comfortable sharing? Or
So
was
the
it
only thing that
emotional?
happened
Mhm.
before marriage was, psychological abuse that I wasn't able to realize, being within that situation that that's what was happening. It's an interesting thing when you are on the outside of the relationship after the fact. You can think back at various incidents and say, wow, this is what was actually happening. I just didn't know at that time. So a
Did
couple things he did is he, you know, took on this project of isolation. And this is something that I've seen happen to friends as well, where slowly, you're in a relationship with someone, they're meeting your friends,
right.
and one by one, somehow your friends are disappearing and you can't understand what's happening. And he
Wow.
is, engaging in this project where he is removing the people in your life that you lean on and that you rely on.
Yeah, I was
Now,
one of them. I was one
yeah,
of them.
if
We didn't talk for like 4 years because of him. I remember that, and
so,
thankfully
I would
that's
say,
over
there's
now.
two pieces of
Mhm.
advice that I would give here.
Yeah.
One is if you have a friend that's in a relationship that you were very close with them before, and you find that they're being distant. Now, a lot of people credit this to they're being distant because they're busy with their new life.
Right.
This is something I do not do with any of my friends.
Mhm.
I have right now several friends, something I know I've mentioned to you before, going through sort of this process that I had gone through.
Okay.
And one thing I do is, typical, you call someone, you leave a voicemail or a text message, and you wait for them to call back. If they don't call you back, you might do it one more time, but that's it. Otherwise you feel like the person is not, responding to you. One
Mhm.
thing I do is I actually pester people now. For friends that I know
Oh,
that are in these situations, I will call
okay.
them and I will call them 7, 8 times with no embarrassment of having called
Right.
this person that many times till they finally answer the phone. Because really, you don't really know what's going on in other people's lives.
But
So that
sorry,
for me is one of the key takeaways. The
you
other
would
key,
pester them, just because I wanna clarify for everyone. So,
yes.
like, you would call them a few times a day, but you already know they're in an abusive relationship at this point, or you just feel
Whether you
something is
know or
off?
not, if you have someone that's now either newly in a relationship and you're seeing a change in their behavior,
Mhm.
still call them, still check in on them. And if you know someone has had an argument or is, possibly starting to go through a situation like the one that I've been through, I would call constantly. Sometimes I would call and leave 3 voicemails before someone calls me back, which is not really the etiquette of, calling your friends,
Today.
right?
Yeah, it's
But I
not it's
still
not
do I
today's
still
way.
do it now and I don't feel bad about it or them not responding to me because I've had that experience.
Okay.
And there's a second piece of advice that I'd want to
Yes.
share here, sort of in this area.
Yes.
Uh, you know, you will not see your relationship clearly from within your relationship. So if
Mhm.
you have people in your life that you trust that tell you something about the person you're with, don't take it as that person's jealous or that person doesn't want to see
Right.
my happiness or that person
Yeah.
doesn't really know my partner or that person doesn't really know what's happening in my relationship. Sort of heed that advice. Think thoughtfully about what people try to say. So that's all part of this isolation project. You cannot get the opinions of other people if you're isolated from your friends and your family. I've
Yeah.
had friends tell me now after hearing my experience,
Yeah.
I want you to tell me. If something is happening in my relationship, I want you to tell me. I want you to interfere. I want you to do what is the opposite of social convention, or what is the opposite of being appropriate. I want you to tell me, because they themselves have also realized that we don't know from the inside of a situation what's really happening. We can't see clearly till we're outside of that situation. And I think one of the godsends in my relationship was that I was never isolated from my family. Although I lost most of my friends, I
Yeah.
stayed very close to my family, and he
Mhm.
tried to put blame on my mom or blame on my brother for
Mhm.
interfering in our marriage. And he wasn't successful in that regard. So I still had people to lean on when I was trying to get out. And not everyone is, as lucky as I am in that sense.
Yeah, thank God you had them still around.
Yes.
And so before marriage, it was just mainly psychological abuse, you said. So what
Yeah,
happened?
little like kind of temper tantrums,
Right.
overreactions to things like,
Yeah.
you know, I've lost my, credit card. The reaction to that is that's awful. Let's
Mhm.
retrace your steps. Let's call and cancel the card.
Right.
But, the reaction you're getting is an irrational reaction. This is your fault. You
Like,
distracted me. Instead of dealing with the problem, they're angry about the problem.
yeah.
That's sort of another example of the type of thing that would happen.
And it actually creates an environment where you feel like you have to walk on eggshells around that person. And I remember because I visited you at a time when you were married and or at least you lived together at the time. And I remember you acting that way and I could see it. And because you and I don't live in the same, let's say, geographical area, we weren't able to see each other that often, but when I saw that, I noticed, like, there were a few red flags on my end that I noticed, but we can talk about that later if you
And
want
I
to.
think this is so important. Like, yes, the relationship is
Mhm.
between the two people, and that is our
Yeah.
social convention that we understand.
Mhm.
But there is a role for friends and family when someone is in a relationship. Given kind of this, the story I'm sharing here today is not unique. I'm sure people that
No.
are will be listening to this and say, I've gone through the same thing, or I saw my friend go through the same thing, or I saw my family member go through the same thing. These are
Yeah,
repetitive patterns, that
absolutely.
we see over and over again in unhealthy relationships.
Absolutely, I agree. So, you were in a graduate program when you were just married, right? You were still in a graduate program?
Yeah, so I was doing a PhD
Mhm.
when I had met my ex-husband.
Mhm.
Which is one of the things that bothers me till now is that you got into a relationship with someone that was already pursuing a high level of, career advancement and education.
Right.
I always think this in retrospect. You knew what you were getting into. If
Mhm.
that was something you were not interested in, you probably should have looked in another direction.
Yeah. If he wasn't genuinely interested in your you advancing yourself as a person, like, in your self-development, then I think but that's another red flag too. If someone doesn't want you to be your best or the best version of yourself, why are they holding you back? Like, they must have a huge insecurity. I think that's what I see in this kind of context. Okay, so, what would he do? Like, did he support you? Was he actually supportive of you doing your PhD?
So this is kind of the MO of the narcissist, right?
Okay.
And again, like I've seen this happen again and again in my relationship where you're supportive to a certain extent
Mhm.
so that the other person feels you're being supportive, and when that support stops, the sort of narcissist partner is able to say, um, it stopped because of your actions, not because of my actions. Remember, I
Mhm.
used to do this and I used to do that, right?
Yeah.
So this is sort of the trigger that we were talking about earlier that I was able to realize after I was actually married. So my education was one of the main triggers of the accelerated temper, arguments, and increasing abuse in my marriage. I would find that arguments would happen around the time that I had to take an exam or the time that
Mhm.
I had a big presentation. It was always specifically timed for me to not do well in my program. Um, I saw a massive change after I got pregnant. What was sort of these infrequent outbursts of temper and of blaming me for things that were entirely out of my control
Wow.
accelerated. They became frequent to the point where I couldn't go 24 hours. without being yelled at for something. And this is something that
Wow.
was happening, weeks apart before.
Mm-hmm. And now it's
And,
daily while you're pregnant.
yeah, when I did
Was
my research sort of on this after, kind
right.
of my sort of post-trauma coping mechanism was doing research and trying to understand, what had actually happened.
I'm the
And
same way.
during yeah,
I
during this
love
time,
that. Yeah.
I met with a lot of I met not with a lot. I met multiple times with uh, a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that I sort of discovered through that process was that
Okay.
the sort of narcissist personality involves a personality type where everyone in that person's life is an extension of that person. They're there to serve that person. Um, and when it was found that I was pregnant, his thinking was, now that should be your focus because this child is going to be an extension of me. You should have no other priorities in your life. And the abuse accelerated a lot during
Okay.
that time.
I have a quick question. When you got pregnant, had you already graduated?
No, I was still studying at the time.
Oh,
I was still studying at the
okay.
time.
Okay, okay. Was he pushing you to get pregnant? Like, was he really encouraging the idea or it just
No, no, I
okay.
I did want kids myself.
Mhm, but
But
at that
my
time.
understanding of what raising a family with a partner was very different from his understanding that all members of the household are there to serve him.
Right.
So eventually, at the very end of our marriage, he said to me, what does getting your PhD do to serve your husband? I think I had gone to the library and I had studied and maybe I had missed dinner. Something had happened that evening.
Right.
He came back and he said, what does that do? How does that help me?
Yeah, the world revolves around him, I guess.
But it was
That's what he
clear. It
thinks.
was clear in that moment,
Wow.
at the end of our marriage. But that is what he was saying all along. But he wasn't using
Mhm.
those direct words.
Mhm. I see. So, and I think you had told me that he found like a card you got to say congratulations on your PhD as well. And you had already given birth at this time?
I did. So when
Okay.
I finished my PhD, I had a 6-week old newborn.
Oh, wow.
And one thing I'll say, I'm proud of myself for being able to finish it under those conditions
Me too.
because,
Me too. I'm so proud of you.
I didn't have help with child rearing. That was
Mhm.
on my own. I did my PhD dissertation defense sort of, with a newborn in the stroller next to me.
That's amazing.
I didn't have help in that regard. Um, so at this point, I was determined that the process of the PhD that I started before I even met my ex was something that was very important to me. My education has been very important to me. My career has always been very important to me. And I
Mhm.
don't feel I feel that has added worth to my life. I don't feel that that's taken away from family life or for anything else really in that regard, from friendships, from, I feel that is something that people have respected in me
Yes.
and it became sort of a core part of my personality. But
Mhm.
by this time, I realized, there was going to be issues when I had major educational requirements like exams or presentations that I needed to get through. So I decided, and this is just really in the last 2 weeks of my marriage, right? We're at the end here, that I'm not going to tell my husband at the time when my dissertation defense was, because I
Yeah.
was honestly at that point, my eyes are starting to open, worried that I would not make it to my defense if he knew what date it was on.
Wow.
So I
I'm
got
so
up that
happy.
morning and me
Mhm.
and the baby went to the university and I did my dissertation defense. So the tradition in a lot of places is that when you complete your defense in front of your committee, you toast to champagne.
Right.
This is the Western tradition of finishing a PhD.
Okay.
And at the time, I was nursing, and I said, I told my committee, you go ahead. I'm not going to have any champagne. And they said, no, no, take it home. So they put it in the bag, and the card on the bag says, "Congratulations,
Mhm.
Dr. Jasmine."
Right.
So I I go home and I say, let me just give this champagne and this nice bag to my neighbors. They're so friendly. They're always helping out with things. So I rip the card off that has my name on it and I leave it on the kitchen table. And I go next door to give this gift to my
Yeah.
neighbors. And he found that card. And I think
Mm.
reading, Dr. Jasmine on that card was probably the breaking point for him because I had acquired the title. Right now,
Mhm.
up until now, it was all theoretical.
Right.
Would
Yep.
she actually do it? Would she actually finish, or will she just now focus on the baby that she has?
Right.
And for me, always there is no distinction. Focusing on the baby is part of bettering yourself is focusing on your family, right?
Yeah.
So, it was within 24 hours of him finding that card that we separated.
Okay, can you explain the process that you had to go through?
Right. So, how we actually separated was, at this point, our neighbors were familiar. We were in a condo with hearing the arguing.
Okay.
This was among the worst fights we had that night. And the same neighbors that I gave the bottle of champagne to actually called the cops.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually gonna ask you if there was police involvement. Jasmine, are you comfortable sharing? Was there physical abuse in the relationship and while you were pregnant too? Because this is a real common tactic of men involved in domestic violence. Like I've also done research about it before, doing this interview with you, and I've seen a lot of the even the police questionnaires when they're assessing risks of a domestic violence partner, the perpetrator. They actually one of the questions is, were you abused during pregnancy?
So there was physical abuse, but I don't want to focus on it. And I'm going to tell you
Mm-hmm.
why. Because this
Tell
was
me.
a very minimum
Okay.
portion of the abuse I received. And I think that
Okay.
psychological abuse, verbal abuse,
Mm-hmm.
is just as harmful, but is even more difficult for maybe law enforcement or for just the general public to really grasp that this is a
Mm-hmm.
true form of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Isolating from friends and family, psychological abuse. This is just as serious as the other kind. And I would say that that's what made up the majority of my marriage. The other
Okay.
stuff happened a couple times in isolation, but I
Right.
would have arrived at the same place even without it.
Yeah, I understand. I understand because
So
yeah,
those same neighbors
psychological
I was
abuse.
saying, they call the cops. The cops come. They say, this is a domestic issue. We're here to see what the situation was. And he wasn't able to control his temper.
Okay.
And this is a very dangerous situation because the geographic location that this was happening in, normally if there's a domestic situation and there's a child involved, social services get involved to check on the well-being of the child.
Correct.
Um, you know, I don't know if I was lucky or that I was just, I guess lucky that I received two officers that were very experienced come to the scene.
Good.
That essentially said, "We see this every single day."
Yep.
And they said, "We're not going to write a police report on this incident because
Mm,
we can see that the child is essentially in good hands. You know,
okay.
you're able to sit down rationally and talk to us, explain that you're the sole child, child rearer in the household. Um, we're not going to write a report. Let's not make it messy. We don't see our assessment on the ground is that this child is not in harm if this individual is removed from the home."
Exactly. Okay, so that's a good point that you made. Fine, like thank God the child is not at harm, but he needs to be removed. So I
So he
were there any
was. He,
records
he
on
had
him?
to leave. He had to
Mhm.
leave with the officers that night.
Good.
And it was some months later that he was escorted with police presence to remove his belongings.
Oh
So
wow.
I was not
Okay.
there at that time. I left the condo. Um, he came in with two police officers and removed his stuff.
Thank you so much for listening to Jasmine's story. I really hope that she's inspired you so far, and there's so many more great inspirational stories to share in part 2 of this episode series. Please listen out as she's going to tell us more about her positive experience with the legal system, even though she was forced to leave the country with a baby. She really has some great news for us at the end of it. And again, I really hope that she inspires you to stay strong for yourself and to stay strong for your friends too.